The estate sale was a treasure trove of oddities, antique furniture, dusty books, and curious trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum. Mara had no intention of buying anything when she wandered in, but then she saw it, a vintage camera sitting on a table near the back. It was a boxy, weathered Polaroid with ornate engravings along its edges. The tag read, 1948, owner unknown. Mara picked it up, surprised by its weight. Something about it felt different, almost alive. The estate sale worker, a man with a tired expression, saw her examining it. "Odd piece, isn't it?" he said. "Belonged to the family that used to live here. They were big on photography, but no one knows much about this one. Found it locked in the attic." "How much?" Mara asked. The worker shrugged. $50. "But fair warning, thing's been giving people the creeps. Buyer before you brought it back the same day, said it was broken." Mara smiled. She loved fixing old things. "I'll take it." That evening, Mara sat at her kitchen table, inspecting her new find. The camera was in excellent condition for its age, but it felt unusual. The engravings weren't just decorative. They looked deliberate, almost like symbols. She pressed a few buttons and heard the faint whir of the mechanism inside. "Still works," she muttered, surprised. She set the camera on her counter and took her first shot, aiming it at her living room. The flash went off, and a Polaroid began to print. She pulled the photo out and waited for the image to develop. When it did, her stomach dropped. The photo showed her living room exactly as it was, but there was someone in the corner. A shadowy figure stood by the window, partially obscured by the curtain. Mara spun around, but the room was empty. "It's just a glitch," she said aloud, though her voice wavered. She took another picture, this time of her hallway. The photo developed quickly, and Mara felt a cold chill run down her spine. The same figure was there, standing at the end of the hall, closer now. Heart pounding, she grabbed the camera and shoved it into her bag. Maybe she was overtired, or maybe the camera really was broken. She'd take it to a shop tomorrow to get it checked out. But that night, she couldn't sleep. The next morning, Mara took the camera to a local photography store. The owner, an older woman named Alice, greeted her warmly. "This is a beautiful piece," Alice said, inspecting the camera. "Where'd you find it?" "Estate sale," Mara replied. "It works, but there's something off about the photos it takes." Alice nodded knowingly. "Old cameras can be finicky. Let me take a closer look." As Alice examined the engravings, her expression shifted. "This isn't just decoration," she said, her voice low. "These are protection symbols. You don't see this often." "Protection from what?" Mara asked, uneasy. Alice hesitated. "Some people believed cameras could steal a person's essence. These symbols might have been a way to ward off something. I'd be careful with this." Mara left the shop more unsettled than ever. That evening, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to test the camera again, this time outdoors. She walked to the park, snapping photos of empty benches, trees, and lampposts. Each time the photos developed with strange anomalies, shadows that didn't match, blurred faces where no one had been. One photo made her freeze. It showed a couple sitting on a bench, but their faces were blank, featureless. Behind them, a figure loomed, tall and dark, its hand reaching for the man's shoulder. Mara turned the camera over in her hands, her breathing shallow. The camera wasn't broken. It was showing her something she wasn't meant to see. And it wasn't done yet. Mara sat in her living room, the eerie photos spread out on the coffee table. Each one showed something more disturbing than the last. Blank faces, shadowy figures, and distorted scenes that didn't match reality. The images were unmistakably tied to the camera, but the why remained a mystery. As her unease grew, she noticed something strange. In the photos she had taken of the park, the dark figure seemed to move closer frame by frame. In the last photo, it stood at the edge of the park, its shadow extending toward her, as if reaching through the lens. Mara shuddered. She needed answers. The next day, she returned to the estate sale house. The worker from before greeted her with a puzzled expression. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said. "Something wrong with the camera?" "You could say that," Mara replied. "Do you know anything about the family who owned it?" The worker hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Not much. The last owner, old Mrs. Whitaker, passed away a couple of months ago. Quiet lady, lived alone for years. But people say the house has history. Weird history." "What kind of history?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Her husband was a photographer, real eccentric, collected all kinds of strange equipment. One day, he just disappeared. Poof. Some say he ran off. Others say the camera took him." Mara's blood ran cold. The camera took him. "Just an old wives' tale," the man said with a nervous chuckle. "But Mrs. Whitaker never got rid of his things. Maybe she couldn't." That night, Mara couldn't stop thinking about the story. She searched online for anything about the Whitakers. Hours of digging led her to an old newspaper article. "Photographer vanishes without a trace. Local artist leaves behind cryptic works." The article detailed how Harold Whitaker, a renowned photographer, had gone missing in 1948. His final series of photographs had been described as disturbing and unexplainable, depicting people with blurred or absent features and shadowy figures in the background. Critics thought it was some kind of avant-garde art. The article included a photo of Harold standing with the very same camera Mara now owned. Her hands shook as she read the final line of the piece. "Whitaker's camera, considered his most prized possession, was never found." Determined to learn more, Mara decided to visit Alice, the photography shop owner, again. She brought the disturbing photos with her. Alice frowned as she studied them. "These aren't normal," she said. "The distortions, those figures, they're not artifacts or glitches. They're something else. Something alive." Mara swallowed hard. "I found an article about the camera's original owner. He disappeared. Do you think? Could the camera have something to do with it?" Alice hesitated, her expression grim. There are stories about cameras like this, cursed or enchanted objects that trap pieces of what they photograph. Some say the spirits of those who've been captured linger inside, tethered to the object. "Trapped?" Mara asked, horrified. Alice nodded. "If that's true, the camera might be more than just cursed. It could be a doorway." Mara left the shop with more questions than answers. That night, she decided to push the camera further. She set it on a tripod in her living room, its lens pointed at herself. "This is crazy," she muttered, staring at its empty, glassy eye. Still, she pressed the shutter. The flash blinded her momentarily, and the camera whirred as it printed the photo. When it developed, she saw herself sitting on the couch. But something was wrong. In the photo, the room was darker, and her reflection in the nearby mirror wasn't sitting still. It was standing, its face turned toward her, smiling. A loud click broke the silence. The camera had taken another photo, on its own. Mara's breath caught as she stared at the second photo. Her hands trembled as she pulled it from the camera. This time the image showed her entire living room. But it wasn't empty. A man stood in the corner near the bookshelf. He was dressed in vintage clothing, his face blurred and distorted, as though he were moving too fast for the camera to capture him clearly. She spun around, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The room was empty, or so it seemed. "Who are you?" she whispered. The camera clicked again. The third photo developed quickly, the glossy surface revealing a scene that made Mara's stomach churn. The man was closer now, his head tilted unnaturally as though watching her. Behind him, shadowy hands emerged from the walls, clawing toward her reflection in the mirror. Mara grabbed the camera and threw it into her bag. She couldn't stay in the house, not while it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She drove straight to Alice's shop, bursting in without preamble. "Alice, it's happening. The camera, it's alive." Alice gestured for her to calm down. "Tell me everything." Mara spread the photos across the counter, each one more horrifying than the last. Alice's face darkened as she studied them. "This isn't just a cursed object," Alice said quietly. "This is something much worse. It's a tether, a way for spirits to cling to this world." "Spirits?" Mara echoed. Alice nodded, her eyes locked on the photo of the man. "I think this is Harold Whitaker. If he was experimenting with this camera, trying to capture more than just images, he may have trapped himself in it. And he's not the only one." Mara's heart sank. "How do I stop it?" Alice hesitated, then reached under the counter to pull out an old book. She flipped through the pages, finally stopping at an illustration that sent a chill through Mara's spine. A camera surrounded by swirling shadows. "This," Alice said, tapping the page, "is a ritual for severing the connection between the camera and the spirits it holds. But it's dangerous. If you fail, the tether could extend to you." Mara clenched her fists. "I don't care. I can't let this thing haunt me, or anyone else, any longer." That night, Mara prepared for the ritual. Alice had given her a list of instructions. Light 4 candles around the camera, use a mirror to reflect its lens, and recite an incantation to sever the bond. As she arranged the candles in her living room, the camera sat on the table, silent and still. Mara couldn't help but feel as though it was watching her, waiting for her next move. When everything was in place, she lit the candles and positioned a mirror in front of the camera. The reflection of the lens gleamed like an eye staring back at her. She began to recite the incantation, her voice trembling. "Break the bond, release the hold, free the souls that remain untold." The room grew colder. The shadows on the walls began to shift, and a low hum filled the air. The camera clicked, though Mara hadn't touched it. "Release them," she said louder, her voice steadying. The mirror's surface rippled, and the room seemed to warp around her. The man from the photos appeared in the mirror, his features now clear. It was Harold Whitaker. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Behind him, the shadowy hands returned, clawing at his figure and pulling him back. Mara shouted the incantation one final time, her voice cutting through the hum. The camera shuddered violently, the mirror cracked, and a burst of light filled the room. When the light faded, the room was eerily quiet. The candles had gone out, and the camera sat on the table, inert and lifeless. Mara picked it up cautiously. This time it felt empty, like any other inanimate object. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see something out of place, but everything seemed normal. She developed the final photo. It showed her living room as it was now, empty, quiet, and still. No figures, no shadows, no anomalies. For the first time in days, Mara exhaled in relief. Mara returned the camera to Alice the next morning. "It's done," she said simply. Alice nodded, taking the camera from her. "You were brave." Not everyone could have done what you did." "What will you do with it?" Mara asked. "Destroy it," Alice replied. "Some objects aren't meant to survive." As Mara left the shop, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. But as she walked down the street, she caught a glimpse of herself in a shop window. For a split second, her reflection lingered, smiling when she wasn't.